The line does not exist. There is no ledger entry, no eyewitness transcript, no royal diary in which Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, ever utters the words, "Tous mangent de la brioche." Let them eat cake. Historians searching the archive for the origin of the most infamous sentence in French history do not find it in the mouth of a doomed queen. They find it in the memoirs of a philosopher. In Book 6 of his Confessions, written around 1766 and published posthumously in 1782, Jean-Jacques Rousseau recounts an anecdote about an unnamed great princess, who, upon hearing that the peasantry had no bread, suggested they eat brioche instead. At the time Rousseau claims to be recalling this remark, Marie Antoinette was a child of perhaps 10 years old, still living in the Habsburg court of Vienna, nowhere near Versailles, nowhere near a starving French peasant. The quote predates her arrival in France entirely. Some historians point instead to Maria Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, who lived nearly a century earlier. The myth was not history. It was character assassination, retrofitted decades after the fact and canonized by revolutionaries who needed a villain, and needed her to be one who did not understand the single most volatile commodity in the kingdom she ruled. Because in 18th century France, bread was not food in the abstract sense we use the word today. It was the unit of survival. It was political currency, measured, taxed, rationed, and rioted over. To accuse a queen of not understanding bread was to accuse her of not understanding the nation itself. That the accusation was fabricated does not diminish its power, it proves it. The lie only worked because everyone already knew, control bread, and you control the state. Lose bread, and the state falls. This idea, that a flattened baked mixture of ground grain and water could hold that much civilizational weight, did not begin with monarchy. It began roughly 14,400 years before Marie Antoinette was ever born, in the scorched basalt landscape of what is now northeastern Jordan. At a site called Shabeka I, in a region archaeologists call the Black Desert, a team from the University of Copenhagen, led by archaeologist Tobias Richter, with analysis conducted by archaeobotanist Amaya Aranzotigui and bread specialist Laura Gonzalez Carretero, uncovered 24 charred food fragments in the remains of 2 ancient stone fireplaces. These were not the remains of farmers. They belonged to the Natufians, a semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer culture that occupied the site during a window dated to roughly 14,600 to 11,600 years before present. Under scanning electron microscopy, the fragments revealed a porous internal structure consistent with baked, leaven-free dough, the unmistakable signature of bread. The grains identified within it were wild, undomesticated cereals, wild einkorn wheat, among others, ground, sieved, and kneaded before cooking, alongside clubrush tubers. This finding, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018, overturned a foundational assumption of archaeology. Bread had always been treated as a downstream consequence of agriculture, something humans invented only after they had already domesticated wheat and barley, settled into villages, and organized themselves around fixed fields. Shabeka I reversed the causality. Bread predates farming by at least 4,000 years. Hunter-gatherers, moving across a landscape they did not yet control, were already grinding wild grain into flour and firing it into flatbread over stone hearths, long before a single seed was deliberately planted in soil. This changes the entire shape of the story. It suggests, as Aranzotigui and her collaborators have proposed, that the labor-intensive desire to keep producing bread, a food requiring grinding stones, sustained fire management, and painstaking processing of tough wild grains, may be one of the pressures that pushed humans toward agriculture in the first place, rather than the other way around. Civilization, in this reading, was not the cause of bread. Bread may have been one of the causes of civilization. What began as a hunter-gatherer's improvisation over an open flame in the Black Desert would, over the following 14 millennia, become the single most politically explosive foodstuff on Earth, fought over, taxed, rationed, weaponized, and eventually blamed, falsely, on a queen who never said the words history remembers her for. Rome did not conquer Egypt for its pyramids. It conquered Egypt for its wheat. By the time Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE and annexed Egypt as a personal possession of the emperor rather than a province of the Senate, the Nile Valley had already been recognized as the single most productive grain-growing region in the Mediterranean world. Its annual floods deposited nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain with a reliability no other Roman territory could match. Egyptian wheat, alongside grain from Sicily and North Africa, fed the Annona, Rome's state-administered grain dole, a program that by the early imperial period distributed subsidized or free wheat to hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens each month. The annona was not charity. It was governance. An emperor who kept the grain fleets running kept Rome quiet. An emperor who let the shipments falter risked riot in the streets of the capital itself. Bread, or rather, the wheat that became it, was the mechanism by which the most powerful empire in the ancient Mediterranean purchased the political consent of its own population. That logic did not end with Rome. It repeated itself, with remarkable structural consistency, across 1,000 years of subsequent European history. In medieval England, the state's grip on bread took the form of law rather than dole. In 1266, under the reign of Henry III, the Crown codified the assize of bread and ale, widely regarded as the first law in English history to regulate the production and sale of a food commodity. The assize did not fix the price of a loaf. It fixed the weight of the loaf relative to fluctuating wheat prices. When grain was expensive, the loaf shrank. When grain was cheap, it grew. Bakers who cheated the standard, shorting their customers on weight to protect their margins, faced escalating punishment, from fines to the pillory. The assize would remain in continuous force, in various revised forms, for nearly 600 years, not fully repealed until 1863. Its longevity reveals something essential. No medieval English monarch, however weak, could afford to let bread pricing go unregulated. To lose control of the loaf was to lose control of the realm. France would learn, violently, what happens when that control is deliberately released. In September 1774, the newly appointed Controller General of Finances, and Robert-Jacques Turgot, moved to liberalize France's internal grain trade, abolishing the price controls, subsidies, and royal storehouses that had traditionally buffered the population against shortage. Turgot was acting on physiocratic economic theory, which held that free trade in grain would optimize supply and stabilize prices over the long term. The timing was catastrophic. The harvest of 1774 was poor. By the spring of 1775, wheat prices in Paris had surged, and rumors circulated that the shortage was not natural but engineered, that merchants, and perhaps the crown itself, were hoarding grain to profit from desperation. Between April and May 1775, in what became known as the Guerre de Farines, the Flour War, roughly 300 separate riots erupted across the Paris basin and beyond. Crowds stormed mills, granaries, and grain convoys, seizing flour and enforcing what they considered the just price, a practice historians call taxation populaire, popular taxation. Louis XVI deployed troops to crush the unrest. Hundreds were arrested, and the riots subsided. But the underlying condition, a population whose caloric survival depended almost entirely on the price of a single commodity, and a monarchy perceived as either unable or unwilling to protect that price, did not go away. It waited. 14 years later, it detonated. The women who marched on Versailles in October 1789, dragging cannons through the rain and demanding that the royal family return with them to Paris, were not carrying an abstract revolutionary ideology. They were carrying the memory of the Flour War, and the daily arithmetic of a diet in which bread constituted, by most historical estimates, roughly 3/4 of an ordinary laborer's caloric intake, with the poorest workers spending up to half their income on it alone. When Marie Antoinette was later credited with the words, "Let them eat cake," the fabrication succeeded not because it was true, but because it perfectly named the crime the French public already believed the monarchy had committed, a catastrophic failure to understand that in this kingdom, whoever controlled bread controlled the state's legitimacy itself. This pattern, grain as the currency of political power, bread scarcity as the trigger of revolt, would recur again and again in the centuries that followed, in the forced grain requisitions of Stalin's Soviet Union, in the wheat blockades of both world wars, in the bread price shocks that helped ignite unrest across the Arab world in the 21st century. But its template, its proof of concept, was carved into the fabric of European statecraft long before any of them, in the granaries of Roman Egypt, in the assize courts of medieval England, and in the flour-dusted streets of a French kingdom that mistook a loaf of bread for a small thing. Continuing with the same methodology as Act I, sentence by sentence, with longer sentences split into natural sub-beat clauses, marked by colons, dashes, or lists, to keep every distinct visual idea represented. Named historical figures, Octavian, Cleopatra, Turgot, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, etc., are rendered as costumed reenactment portrayals for documentary purposes, not claimed as authentic photographs of the real individuals. Language remembers what history forgets. And the English language, in particular, buried an entire economic system inside two words we still use every day without a second thought: Lord and Lady. According to the Oxford English Dictionary and confirmed independently through etymological analysis of Old English texts, the word lord descends from hlaford, itself a contraction of the earlier compound hlafword, literally loaf ward, the guardian of the loaf. Its counterpart, lady, comes from Old English leftage, combining laugh, loaf, with an element related to dage, kneader of dough. A lord, in the most literal etymological sense available to us, was the person who guarded the household's bread supply. A lady was the person who made it. Even the Old English word for servant, hlafita, translates directly as loaf-eater, one who eats another's bread, and is therefore bound to them. Anglo-Saxon social hierarchy was not built on abstract concepts of command or nobility of blood. It was built, at the level of vocabulary itself, on the physical control and distribution of baked grain. To be a lord was not to rule people in the abstract. It was to be the one who fed them, and who could, by extension, choose not to. This is not a linguistic curiosity confined to Old English. Trace the word for bread itself, laugh, back through the Germanic language family, and it connects to a reconstructed Proto-Germanic root, klibus, the common ancestor behind Old Norse hlifr, Old High German hleb, modern German leb, and Gothic leifs. This is the same root, philologists have long noted, that likely underlies the Slavic word for bread, chleb, a linguistic bridge suggesting contact and borrowing between early Germanic and Slavic-speaking peoples in the shared agricultural landscape of early medieval Europe, long before either group had a written language of its own. Follow a different branch of the Indo-European tree, however, and the story changes entirely. In the Romance languages, French pain, Spanish pan, Italian pain, the word for bread descends not from the Germanic laugh lineage at all, but from Latin panis. And panis carried its own social architecture into the vocabulary that survives today. The Latin phrase cum panis, with bread, produced the vulgar Latin companio, meaning, at its root, one with whom you share bread. A messmate, a person bound to you not by blood or law but by the simple ancient act of eating from the same loaf. That word migrated directly into English as companion, and its abstracted form, company, now describes everything from a close circle of friends to a multinational business corporation. A linguistic fossil recording the moment when sharing bread was the defining act of trust between two human beings. Two entirely separate language families, then, Germanic and Romance, arrived independently at the same conclusion embedded permanently into their vocabulary. That bread was the material basis of social bonding, obligation, and hierarchy. The lord who guarded the loaf and the companion who shared it were not separate ideas. They were two branches of the same root system, growing outward from the same fundamental fact of pre-modern life, that access to baked grain determined who commanded you, who served you, and who you could trust. This linguistic fingerprint did not stay confined to Europe. As Roman trade networks, and later Islamic and European mercantile and colonial routes, carried wheat cultivation and processing techniques across the Mediterranean basin, into North Africa, the Levant, and eventually the Americas and South Asia, the vocabulary of bread moved with it, sometimes absorbed wholesale into local languages, sometimes layered over existing indigenous grain traditions that had never used wheat at all. Every word for bread carried in its syllables a record of exactly which empire, which trade route, and which conquest had delivered the loaf to that particular corner of the world. For roughly 14,000 years, the fundamental physics of making bread barely changed. Grain was ground between stones, mixed with water, given time to ferment, and baked. The rate-limiting factor was always the same: human time, human labor, and the patience of fermentation. Two 20th-century interventions, one American, one British, would break that constraint permanently, and in doing so, would transform bread from an artisanal necessity into an industrially infinite commodity. The first was mechanical, not chemical. On July 7, 1928, in the small town of Chillicothe, Missouri, a struggling bakery called the Chillicothe Baking Company installed a machine invented by a jeweler-turned-engineer named Otto Frederick Rohwedder. Rohwedder had spent over a decade, and, at one point, his entire life's work, destroyed in a 1917 factory fire, trying to solve a problem the baking industry had never considered solvable: automatically slicing a loaf of bread into uniform pieces without collapsing its structure. His device, installed by baker Frank Bench, produced the first commercially sold sliced bread in human history that same day. The public was initially wary. Early advertisements had to include printed instructions on how to open the wrapped, pinned loaf, but sales at Bench's bakery reportedly surged by roughly 1,000 to 2,000% within 2 weeks. Within 5 years, by 1933, American bakeries were producing more sliced bread than unsliced. The invention did not simply save consumers a few seconds with a knife. It restructured the entire industrial bread economy around standardization, uniform loaf geometry, and, critically, compatibility with another emerging technology, the automatic pop-up toaster, patented in 1926. Bread was no longer a shape a baker decided. It was now a specification a machine enforced. The second intervention was chemical and structural, and it happened 3 decades later, in a village outside London. In 1961, a team of food scientists at the British Baking Industries Research Association, among them Norman Chamberlain, Bill Collins, and George Elton, working out of Chorleywood, Hertfordshire, developed what became known as the Chorleywood bread process. The problem they were solving was strategic as much as culinary. Post-war, Britain wanted to reduce its dependence on imported high-protein Canadian and American wheat and instead rely on lower-protein domestic grain, which had never before produced bread of commercially acceptable quality using traditional slow fermentation methods. The Chorleywood solution was radical. Rather than allowing dough to develop its gluten structure gradually over 3 to 5 hours of bulk fermentation, the process used high-speed mechanical mixers, delivering a precisely calibrated energy input of roughly 11 watt-hours per kilogram of dough within about 5 minutes, combined with chemical oxidants, additional yeast, and hard fats, to develop the same structural strength almost instantaneously. A process that had taken the better part of a working day could now be compressed into roughly 3.5 hours, start to finish. The consequences were not confined to Britain. By the early 21st century, the Chorleywood process was reportedly responsible for as much as 80% of the bread produced in the United Kingdom, and it had been licensed and adopted across the Commonwealth, in Australia, South Africa, and beyond. It permitted bread to be manufactured at industrial scale, using cheaper and more geographically flexible wheat stock, with a shelf life and structural consistency that traditional slow-fermented loaves could never reliably match. Bread, for the first time in 14 millennia, had been fully decoupled from the biological patience of fermentation. It had become, functionally, an assembly line product, as standardized and mechanically reproducible as an automobile chassis. Together, the slicing machine and the high-speed mixer accomplished something no empire, tax, or war had ever achieved. They did not merely move bread across borders or redistribute who controlled it. They removed the last constraints of time and human skill from its production entirely, clearing the way for bread to become, within a single generation, one of the most mass-manufactured food products on the planet.